This is Lesson 17.5, the Atlantic World and Global Trade. How did colonial markets boost Europe's economic and social development, and what conflicts and adversity did world trade entail? This is a long but exciting story, and we repeat College Board Topic 3.4, Economic Development and Mercantilism. Economic development, especially the development of capitalism, played an important role in Europe's history, often having significant social, political, and cultural effects. We saw that with the last lesson. Then it says, explain the continuities and changes in commercial and economic developments from 1648 to 1815. We've got a historical thinking skill there, don't we? And it says the transatlantic slave labor system expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries as demand for New World products increased. We also have this College Board Topic 5.2, the rise of global markets. Economic development, especially in the development of capitalism, played an important role in Europe's history, often having significant social and political and cultural effects. So we see a repetition of that. And then it says this, a different historical thinking skill, explain the causes and consequences of European maritime competition from 1648 to 1815. The expansion of European commerce accelerated the growth of a worldwide economic network. Commercial rivalries influenced diplomacy and warfare among European states in the early modern era. Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British rivalries in Asia culminated in British domination in India and Dutch control of the East Indies. And then we have topic 5.3, Britain's ascendancy. Britain is the big winner in this time period. European states and nations developed governmental and civil institutions from 1450 to the present to organize society and consolidate political power with a variety of social, cultural, and economic effects. And it says, explain the economic and political consequences of the rivalry between Britain and France from 1648 to 1815. And we, Americans, are very much involved in that. Rivalry between Britain and France resulted in world wars fought in Europe and in the colonies, with Britain supplanting France as the greatest European power. So we've got all kinds of places, not just Europe. We've got the colonies going on, and we've got England, Dutch Republic, France also, not to mention Prussia, Austria, Russia even. Key concepts of the Atlantic world and global trade: navigation acts, debt peonage, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. One time we did some research. I think there's been something like 11 different treaties of Paris. And then we've got the Atlantic slave trade. So let's get into this. One more quote from Adam Smith. The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Adam Smith. The Atlantic world was hopping in the 1700s. Spain and Portugal were making a comeback. France and Great Britain were upstarts. Britain unified the Atlantic economy the most. The competitive ferocity among countries rose to the level of all-out warfare several times. And the results of these wars shaped the course of modern history. Mercantilism and colonial competition. This was a violent time for countries. Mercantilism, as we know, was aimed at amassing a country's supply of gold. Gold funds armies and navies. We've talked about Jean-Baptiste Colbert's mercantilist policies in France. England also practiced mercantilism under Oliver Cromwell. We met him with the English Civil War and the interregnum. He was involved with King Charles I's execution as a traitor, and then Cromwell ruled England as a military dictator, basically from 1648 to 1658, and he introduced the Navigation Acts. King Charles II, when he came back, he continued the Navigation Acts even after Cromwell was dead and the monarchy had been restored. The Navigation Act specified 5 things. Number 1, most things coming into England from Europe had to be brought in on British ships with British crews. But ships coming from the countries that were actually providing the goods could also be used. Number 3, only British ships could trade with British colonies. Number 4, colonists had to ship their products on British or American ships. And number 5, colonists had to buy almost all European goods from Britain, or at least through Britain. For example, let's say you wanted to buy French wine, right? Well, you had to buy that French wine. You couldn't buy it from France. You had to buy it from Britain. Britain would get it from France for you. There were 3 goals to these navigation acts. Number 1, to eliminate foreign competition for the British workers and merchants. Number 2, to eliminate foreign competition for colonial plantation owners and farmers. And finally, number 3, to give Britain a large shipping industry. This would also train lots of experienced seamen for naval service. The Navigation Acts were themselves a form of economic warfare, particularly against the Dutch Republic. The main target of the Navigation Acts was the Dutch. The English eventually surpassed the Dutch in dominating Atlantic shipping and foreign trade, and they did it with the Navigation Acts. These Navigation Acts, did serious damage to Dutch shipping. The British also accomplished this with three anglo-Dutch wars from 1652 to 1674. And this included the seizure of New Amsterdam in 1664. And by 1674, the British had basically knocked the Dutch out of their way. So their next target, now that the Dutch were out of the way, was France. So the English were willing to take a long, difficult, uncertain road to achieve dominance of the Atlantic trade network. And the Dutch, they were just a dress rehearsal for what was going to go up against France. France had a much higher population than the Dutch Republic. France had Spain as an ally, and France had the biggest land army. France was also working on a huge merchant fleet and a worldwide colonial trade monopoly. So who was going to win this struggle? It was very much in doubt. So round 1 of this struggle turned out to be the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1713, which we talked about with regard to Louis XIV, because he was king of France at the time, and the entire war was really about the succession of his grandson, Philippe, to the Spanish throne. So we've seen that it was fought over the heir to the Spanish crown. We've already seen how Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, became the potential heir to both the French and Spanish crowns, and this potential union was a huge threat to the balance of power in Europe. The rest of Europe was more than willing to go to war over this, and this potential political union of France and Spain was also a huge threat to the colonies across the Atlantic. So the War of Spanish Succession lasted 12 years until the Treaty of Utrecht was finally signed in 1713, and Louis XIV was forced to give up some of his French colonies in this treaty. There were several big results of this Spanish War of Succession that boosted Britain's dominance of the Atlantic trade economy. Number 1, France had to give up Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay Territory and give those to Britain. Spain also had to give Gibraltar to the British. And this was an extremely strategic piece of territory at the southern tip of Spain. And Gibraltar remains British territory to this very day. And monkeys live there who will steal your food right out of your hand. Spain also had to give Britain the Asiento. The Asiento was an age-old international contract for supplying African slaves to the Americas. It gave Britain control of Spain's West Africa slave trade. The Asiento was basically a monopoly on the slave trade. The Asiento has a very, very long, complicated history, but here's the bottom line of the Asiento. whoever controls the Asiento, whoever has it, gets to regulate and profit from the Atlantic slave trade. So the Asiento is a very, very lucrative financial asset. Britain also got the right to send one ship of merchandise to the Spanish colonies per year. But France and Spain were not out of action yet. This was only round one. Round two, the target, France's close ally, Spain. The British got into it with Spain a couple of times after the Treaty of Utrecht. Britain and Spain tested each other out in the Anglo-Spanish War of 1727 to 1729. There's lots of wars here that you've never even heard of. Spain made a failed attempt to retake Gibraltar from the British. Big mistake. And then the British made a failed attempt to blockade the very important port of Portobello in Panama. The British took Spain on again in the War of Jenkins Ear from 1739 to 1742. And this one was fought over several colonies around the Americas. And the British actually took heavy losses on this one. They had 20,000 casualties, lost 407 ships. And Spain actually came out on top with that one because they only had 9,500 casualties and they only lost about 186 ships. But this war didn't end. It actually just kind of got eclipsed by the War of Austrian Succession. The British took a loss on this round at the hands of Spain. So now we got round three, the War of Austrian Succession, which we'll talk about quite a bit more. It went from 1740 to 1748. So we'll talk about how Maria Theresa, a female, ascended to the Austrian throne. Other countries had agreed to let a female be on the Austrian throne, but now that it was actually happening, other countries saw it as a chance to take advantage of a young, inexperienced female monarch. So Frederick II, Frederick the Great of Prussia, he seized the Austrian territory of Silesia in 1740. And Britain and the Dutch Republic, in the meantime, had allied with Austria against Prussia. France and Spain came in on the side of Prussia against Austria. So Britain now fought against both Spain and France. So there were some large naval campaigns in the Caribbean and in South America and in the Mediterranean in this war. Nothing really changed hands at this time, and the war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. You could also call it the Treaty of Aachen. And this treaty actually lasted about 8 years. Below, we've got a YouTube video link of someone who is actually handling the original pamphlet of the treaty printed in 1748 for consumer use. So the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1748 left everybody frustrated. Maria Theresa was confirmed Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary. But in the treaty, Prussia got to keep Silesia, which had started the whole war. And Austria lost some other territory to Italy, to Spain. England was forced to sell the Asiento back to Spain 2 years later in a related treaty, the Treaty of Madrid. And some of the possessions that England and Austria took during the war had to be traded back for other things in the treaty. So nobody was really happy with the way the War of Austrian Succession ended. And Maria Theresa was so angry at Prussia that she vowed to get Silesia back from Prussia, and she also vowed to destroy Prussia in the process. Maria Theresa was also extremely disappointed in her supposed ally, Great Britain. King George II was also the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, which had the city of Hanover in it in Germany. That was his family's ancestral home, actually. And the British decided that their adversary, Frederick II of Prussia, would be better at defending Hanover from France on their behalf than their current ally, Maria Theresa. So the British pressured Maria Theresa into accepting the loss of Silesia to Prussia in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle because they wanted to make Prussia happy. Then we got round 4, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. England hated France and Spain more than anything. They were in the way of England's dominance of the Atlantic world. And so when Maria Theresa got France, Spain, Sweden, and Russia all lined up with her against Prussia, who was Prussia's go-to ally most likely to be? Who was Prussia's Frederick II going to run to, and who was going to be very interested in helping Prussia fight France and Spain? Well, that brings us to the diplomatic revolution of 1756. And this happened before the war actually started. This immediately preceded the war. Britain and Austria had their official falling out in 1756. Keep in mind, Maria Theresa was very, very unhappy with her ally Britain. Britain and Prussia struck a deal. Britain would not help its ally Austria against Prussia. In return, Prussia agreed to protect King George II's possession of Hanover. So for Britain, this was a calculated balance of power decision against France. But Maria Theresa responded to this betrayal and this humiliation by seeking an alliance with, of all people, France. And France's Louis XV did not want to ally with the Habsburgs at first, but British aggression pushed him into it. So Britain and Prussia became allies. They both hoped to divide the resources of this massive coalition that Maria Theresa had put together against Prussia. Prussia was hoping to survive this coalition if Great Britain could divert French and Spanish resources from the continent and out to the Atlantic. Great Britain was hoping to finally achieve its dream of dominating the Atlantic trade. This alliance turned out to be great for Great Britain. All the growth of Great Britain's shipping paid off big in the 7 Years' War. Great Britain swept the field against France and Spain more spectacularly than even they could have imagined. It was a long war, 7 years. It was a difficult war. And it cost the British more money than they could really afford to pay, which was going to be a devastating problem for them. You could say that the British literally won themselves nearly into total bankruptcy. But in the end, when the Treaty of Paris of 1763 was signed, Britain had a monopoly on a huge trading empire in the Atlantic as well as in India. Meanwhile, while Britain was having all this success in the Atlantic, their ally Prussia was staring complete annihilation in the face. Prussia had made very powerful enemies all over Europe, and Prussian King Frederick II had actually started the war by invading Saxony, hoping that that move would intimidate everyone else. That completely backfired on him, and these enemies were now converging upon him. Frederick II bravely led Prussia in battle after battle, even though there was basically no hope of survival. And Prussia's alliance with Great Britain enabled them to survive the onslaught just long enough to catch a miraculous break. At the last possible moment, Empress Elizabeth, 1709 to 1762, of Russia, died. And she had been Peter the Great's daughter by his second wife. And her successor, her nephew, Peter III, admired Prussia so much that he switched sides in the middle of the war, just as Prussia was about to go down and Prussia was saved. The Atlantic economy. There were still 3 major players in the Atlantic economy and a couple of minor players after the 7 Years' War. Great Britain dominated the Atlantic economy. The English linked 4 continents together with their dominance of Atlantic trade. And here's the end game. This Atlantic economy isn't just going to make certain countries rich. It isn't just going to build empires. This Atlantic economy is going to facilitate multiple massive revolutions that are going to change life as we know it on this planet. The consumer revolution that we're going to study in chapter 18, the American and French revolutions that we're going to study in chapter 19, the industrial revolution that we're going to study in chapter 20, all of these are going to drastically change our social, economic, and political paradigms. The triangle trade and how it worked. A cargo ship would take a triangular route in the Atlantic. It would give finished European products like guns and textiles to Africa, sell them there. It would dump those products into the African market in exchange for slaves. So it would pick up slaves in Africa, and it would take those slaves to colonies in South America, the Caribbean, or even North America. It would exchange those slaves for colonial raw materials like sugar, cotton, tobacco, commodities. And it took those raw materials to Europe to be sold for processing into consumer goods. But the triangle trade model wasn't nearly the only part of the Atlantic global economy. The triangle trade was famous because it notoriously facilitated the transport of slaves to the New World. England became rich off of mercantilism and its trade monopoly over its colonies. And there were 2 ways that they made so much money. First, they had an import monopoly on all their products. Re-exportation is importing it and then re-exporting it without any further processing. You're simply taking it in, turning it around, and selling it. And if you were a French merchant and you wanted to bring, let's say, tobacco into France for sale, you couldn't just send a French ship to the American colonies and trade directly with the American colonists for tobacco. All that tobacco had to be shipped to England first. So if you wanted tobacco, you had to buy it from English merchants rather than from the colonists. And these English merchants were going to jack up the price, of course. Of course, if you are willing to risk violating that monopoly and challenging it, and you had colonial contacts who were willing to do the same, you could make some serious money. The second way that England became rich off of this colonial trade monopoly was with processing. A lot of these raw materials required processing to make them into something that consumers could use and would buy. I mean, I can't wear bales of cotton, and I can't clear my sinuses with tobacco leaves. But I can use a box of snuff, and I can wear cotton clothes. Sitting on a log, that gets old. But sitting on a beautiful piece of wooden furniture that's made from the log, that's always great. Or how about animal skin? I won't touch a nasty animal skin, but I'll pay good money for a beautiful fur coat. The point is, these things have to be processed. All of that processing provided lots of manufacturing jobs in England. You could sell these manufactured products in Europe for a nice profit, but what's even better is you can sell these manufactured products right back to your colony. Those colonies don't have tariffs. And not only that, you can make them buy only from you. By the year 1800, 2/3 of British manufactured products were being sold to North America, the West Indies, Ireland, India, West Africa, and Latin America. This market is one of the things that's going to open the door to the Industrial Revolution. England is going to lead the way. If you didn't have this gigantic worldwide market, it's going to be very hard to justify an industrial revolution. The French. The French, as we've seen, had suffered heavy losses to the British in the 7 Years' War, but they were able to keep some very profitable colonies in the Caribbean, and the biggest and most profitable was Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. These colonies relied heavily on slave labor, and France got lots of sugar and coffee from these colonies. But more importantly for French society, it's going to result in a growing wealthy merchant class in all the large French cities. And these guys are going to be some of the most powerful voices clamoring for political reform. And if you don't know what kind of upheaval all this is going to cause, just wait. Spain had been one of the greatest empires in the world, as we've seen. But then we saw its fortunes decline badly back in chapter 15. And we compared the competence with which France practiced mercantilism to the incompetence with which Spain failed to practice it. Also, the Spanish had flooded the world economy with so much silver from South America that it had caused a worldwide inflation, and the silver market cratered. Well, now, in the 18th century, Spain was making a comeback. The global economy had grown its way into kind of filling out all of this silver, and silver was in demand again, and their colonies produced it. Mining camps don't grow their own food. They're too busy mining. And Spain had a vast empire of ranches and agricultural estates that went from Louisiana all the way to Northern California. Spain got Louisiana from the French in 1763 in the Treaty of Paris, but don't worry, the French will get it back. So how do you keep indigenous workers on your estate? The answer, debt peonage. You make sure that everything they buy from you. And you make sure that they'll never make enough to pay you back. And this makes them your virtual slaves. As long as they owe you money, which will be forever, you are their master. That's debt peonage. Well, although the triangle trade was the central Atlantic route, there were many lesser trade routes. There were many routes from colony to colony. And Atlantic trade had strong ties to the Indian Ocean and to the Pacific Ocean. And the assortment of things traded was vast. Sugar, cotton, coffee, rice, tobacco, flour, lumber, livestock, you name it. The Atlantic slave trade. Why were so many people enslaved? Historians debated the reasons and the motives for a long time, and we've talked about the reasons for the slave trade already in this course. Historians have put forth many different arguments. Many of them were attempts to justify slavery. Slaves were too expensive and unskilled to be lucrative, it was said. So it was really the slaves who benefited the most. Africans were introduced to civilization through slavery. And some historians have said that many slaves were war captives and were saved from being executed by being more valuable to their captors as sold slaves. All of these arguments have been put forth in order to, in some way, rationalize the evil of slavery. But commercial crops didn't plant themselves and they didn't harvest themselves. They required huge amounts of labor. And it's no surprise that the Atlantic slave trade kicked into overdrive in the 1700s. 12.5 million Africans were transported to the Western Hemisphere over the course of about 500 years, and more than half of those were transported just in those 100 years between 1700 and 1800. So this was a century in which the slave trade really ramped up. These days, historians have crunched the data, and it has been proven and demonstrated that slave labor was extremely profitable for plantation owners and anyone else who used slaves. And we've talked about that very same thing previously in the course. If you want to know why people participated in slavery and the slave trade, your answer can be summed up in just one word: profit. As you might already know, the vast majority of slaves went to South America and the Caribbean. Only about 3% of African slaves wound up in North America. What about this idea that many slaves were war captives and were saved from execution by being sold by their captors into slavery? There is evidence to support this, but it leads to another question. Was there a lot of slavery because of all the warfare? Or was there a lot of warfare because of all the slavery? During the 1700s, the populations of Europe and Asia grew while Africa's population stagnated. So what finally ended such a lucrative business? Well, British people benefited from slavery more than anyone else in the world. And stories started coming out about how cruel the slave trade and slavery were, and these stories got to the British people in England. Evidence of slavery was all around you. It was in the coffee in your cup. It was in the sugar in your teaspoon. It was in the tobacco in your pipe. It was in the cotton on your clothes. It was in the rum in your glass. Everything in your world, all the things you enjoy, was tainted with human bondage and cruelty and suffering. And the English were starting to feel guilty. It took a long time for stories about the cruelty and the tragedy of slavery to impact the English consciousness. People simply did not think about where their tea and their coffee and their tobacco and their sugar were coming from. They weren't in the Western Hemisphere to see the suffering. William Wilberforce lived from 1759 to 1833, was one of the most prominent English abolitionists. And he's got a quote here. It says, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know." By the 1780s, abolitionism became a mass movement, and in 1807, Great Britain abolished the British slave trade. Slavery itself continued to hang around in British colonies for a long time after that. Even the slave trade didn't end by magic just because people got a law passed. It took a very long fight to shut the slave trade down. Identities and communities of the Atlantic world. As people from all over the Atlantic mixed, new communities and identities evolved over generations. And the first distinct community was the Creoles. The modern notion of a Creole has nothing to do with what Creoles were in colonial times. Back then, a Creole was someone of pure Spanish ancestry who was born in a Spanish colony. They were wealthy plantation owners. They were the colonial elite. They identified more with the home country than with the colonies in which they were born. In time, these wealthy Creoles began to see themselves as more colonial than European. And that's when you begin to realize that the colonial system is designed to make people in the home country richer than yourself. And you see that in the taxes imposed on the colonies. You see it in the kinds of economic activities that colonials are not allowed to engage in. And you see it in the debts that you're racking up to all those European merchants because of all the things that you have to import because they're not produced in your colony. In all the colonies outside of British North America, European men greatly outnumbered European women. We've talked about this already as well. Indigenous people and African people greatly outnumbered all Europeans. So let's say you're a European male and you live in a colony and you want to get married and you want to raise a family. Chances are good that you're going to marry a native or an African. And that brings us to a whole new pantheon of Atlantic identities. Mixed race populations in Spanish America and the Caribbean and Brazil. This was uncharted social territory. Whom do you leave your wealth to when your kids are the same color as your slaves? When your kids are your slaves. So among the wealthiest plantation owners, you have fathers emancipating their mixed-race children, leaving them their wealth as well as land, and even his slaves. Many more people of color weren't given wealth, but they were given their freedom. British North American colonies, however, were different. Entire families tended to go to British North American colonies, so white populations were much higher than in other colonies. British colonies could afford to outlaw interracial marriages. If you had children among your slaves, you simply didn't acknowledge them. You didn't even set them free. It was one of those situations where everyone knows the truth, but everyone goes along with the pretense. The biggest problem for Europeans with these mixed-race people was that they were hard to categorize and thus socially rank. Where exactly do they fit in the social hierarchy? That made their all-important social status hard to determine. And this was a society where people who were clearly European and clearly Christian got far more rights and privileges than people who were not white and not Christian. So this presented a bit of a problem for society. Could you categorize people by just creating new classifications? People tried it. You had new classifications such as mestizo and mulatto and chino. The Spanish brought to the colonies the purity laws and tests that they had used in Spain to exclude Jews and Muslims. And we talked about the origin of these laws way back in chapter 12. And the problem was a lot of lighter-skinned people passed as white into white society and worked their way into the Creole society, which was frustrating for many who wanted to use skin color to isolate, exclude, and exploit other people. How about separating them by culture and language? Well, the problem here was that a mixed race community tended to be a blend of heritage and cultures and practices, so this method was also unreliable. What about by religion? Most whites were Christian, most non-whites were not, and this works great when you want to exclude Jews. No matter where Jews go in the entire colonial system, you could always pass anti-Semitic laws, and these laws will stick if you have a Jewish plantation owner who is a bit richer than you think he deserves to be, and you resent him. You just write a law restricting how many slaves Jews can own, and that law will pass easily, and that Jewish person will be financially ruined. The problem is Catholic missionaries were everywhere. Jesuits and Dominicans and Franciscans were converting native peoples and slaves like crazy, and so they were creating an entire Christian culture. So many plantation owners actually refused to let their slaves be baptized because the last thing they wanted was for their slaves to use their Christianity against them. The interesting thing was that human nature being what it is, these mixed-race communities actually developed their own social hierarchies within their communities. People can self-identify and self-categorize, and these identities were based on such things as job, family, skin color. None of this was a problem for British North America. There were very few mixed-race people living within these colonies and very few Catholic missionaries. Trade in Asia and the Pacific. The Dutch East India Company. We've talked about this in passing. We just mentioned it briefly. So we'll get more into it here, more information here about the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch began sending commercial spice expeditions to the Indian Ocean soon after the Dutch Republic was formed in 1581. And in 1602, the Dutch formed the Dutch East India Company. While the English were giving the Dutch a hard time in the Atlantic, the Dutch dominated in the Indian Ocean throughout the 1600s. The Dutch East India Company lasted almost 200 years from 1602 to 1800. It was one of the first publicly traded companies, meaning that the general public could buy stock ownership in the company. And the Dutch East India Company became the most valuable company of all time. It would be worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. Way more than Apple or Google or Walmart or Disney. And it had as many as 20,000 ships. On the surface, the Dutch East India Company was a shipping and trading company. But in reality, the Dutch East India Company had many more powers and functions than a normal company. For example, it could wage war against other countries. Can you imagine, like, Walmart being able to wage war against other countries? It could imprison and execute convicts. You can't imagine Disney doing that, like Mickey Mouse and executing convicts. It could negotiate treaties with other countries. It could mint its own coins. It could even establish colonies around the world. It was an early transnational corporation, and it was the Dutch Republic's main instrument of warfare. The English and the French. The English also had an East India Company, and they used that company to establish colonies in India, and its purpose was to compete with the Dutch and the Portuguese for trade in India. The French also managed to establish a trading colony in India. The Dutch had dominated trade in the Indian Ocean, and then European tastes started to change. They became less interested in spices, and in addition, the English had established the East India Company to basically go to war with the Dutch in 1600. The English eventually managed to undercut Dutch Indian Ocean trade the way they did it to the Dutch in the Atlantic. And their path to undercutting the Dutch in Asia was through India. They established a foothold in India, and they spent over 150 years chipping away at the Mughal Empire's power and control over their country. In 1716, the British East India Company got the Mughal government to give them access to trade all over their empire. And in 1757, during the 7 Years' War, the East India Company literally fought and won a battle against the French and kicked the French almost entirely out of India. And in 1765, the Mughal government allowed the East India Company to work like a government and collect taxes in several provinces. And this right was called the Diwani. Across the Indian Ocean, the British were starting to colonize Australia. And in the 1780s, a perfect example of the link between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean developed, and that was cowrie shells. And these were seashells, and these cowrie shells came from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean. And they were used as currency over in West Africa. So Europeans would get these cowrie shells from the Maldives, and they would take them to West Africa, and they would trade these cowrie shells for slaves.